Let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40K, and what are their scariest and most powerful armoured behemoths with guns in-game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking tanks in Warhammer 40K, and in this video I thought we'd go through each faction in turn, and talk through the options for what could credibly be their strongest piece of armour. Post-balanced data slate, I thought this was well worth revisiting. I have done this video a couple of times in the past before. The last time just after the start of 10th edition, though I feel like really quite a lot has changed since then in terms of game balance, plus we've had a whole ton of codexes out. In 10th edition though, I feel like tanks and armour have generally been a fair bit more impactful than they were in previous editions of the game, with things like the core keyword keeping them from being some of the scariest damage dealers. But in 10th edition, armour can often be pretty intimidating. High toughness characteristics mean you actually need dedicated anti-tank weapons to bring them down, and often they tend to be some of the best ranged damage dealers in the various indexes and codexes, though for the majority of armies they don't tend to get outright spammed, with things like screening, hiding behind terrain, and objective control being reasons not to go all out on the tank front. In recent times it feels like the Pariah Nexus balance update seems like it could be quite a good time for tanks. Bring It Down isn't particularly effective in terms of getting victory points out of a fair few of the more standard battle tanks out there, and Tank Shot got a fair bit better for a lot of things that aren't big walkers with heavy weapons, though it maybe does feel that perhaps the focus on actions might not necessarily be in their best interest. I guess we'll wait and see how it falls out and what armies get taken. In this video though, I thought I'd focus on one strong battle tank per faction, trying to talk about the ones that I think have a credible argument to be the best where there's an obvious one, and maybe a few near misses that got close. For this one, I'm going to focus on large armoured gun things that do their damage more at range than in melee, even if that is quite a broad category. There's a fair few things that feel like they're kind of walking tanks more so than anything else, and not all factions have a perfect analogue, but I think there's something interesting to talk through for each. Starting off with the Imperium, and first up we have the Space Marines. For them I've chosen to talk about the Gladiator Lancer, which still just off the raw datasheet strength does still feel like certainly one of the best out there. 160 points that you can just put into your list, and it's a tank with enough damage and reliability that enemy armour can't really relax. Two shots that can usually fire the length of the board at strength 14, AP 4 and a big damage d6 plus 3, and then some massive baked in rerolls where you get to reroll one hit, wound and damage results, and between all that they have just some fantastically reliable damage output. Against 3+ save vehicles out of cover, you average a pretty crazy 10 wounds, which is massive for 160 points worth of tank, and doubly helpful that it doesn't really depend on Oath of Moment as well. Its defense is a bit mediocre for the cost, only toughness 10, 12 wounds and a 3+ save isn't particularly standout for 160 points, but at least it can use its good range. It does have a little bit of point defense against enemy infantry getting close, things like Stubbers, Stormbolters and an Icarus pod. In reality, I do feel like quite a lot of Space Marine armoured units are pretty well balanced. I feel like the Lancer is perhaps one of the standout ones outside of dedicated support like Ironstorm, but otherwise the Repulsor Executioner I think is genuinely quite nice and a good tank within it. The Vindicator is pretty savage and has similar damage but a 2+ armour save. The Land Raider variants are all a look in, and I think I would have rated the Redeemer perhaps the best tank pre-nerf, but now it's gone up to 285. I think it's no longer maybe quite a standout, and even beyond that there's plenty of other things that are still very usable. Gladiator Reapers are still nasty in Ironstorm. I'm not going to go into all the chapters for this one, most of them don't really have unique tanks, but for Blood Angels the Bar Predator's certainly worth a mention given the big overwatch it can do in the midfield, and it's fairly cheap. And the Black Templars get their tanks with the bolt-on multi-melters, 10 points to trade out the Stubbers, generally seen as a fairly worth it deal on anything that's scrapping in the midfield. Not too bad on things like Gladiator Reapers or Valiants. Before we go on to the rest of the factions, I'd just like to give a shout out to Baron of Dice, who sponsored this video. They're a pretty high quality dice manufacturer based in the USA, who are currently making some nice custom Auspex dice for a little bit of channel merch. And after talking about those, he asked to sponsor some videos on the channel as well, and feature a bunch of his designs. If you check out the link down in the video description, he's got a pretty spectacular range of things on offer, things that could be appropriate to all kind of model armies. I'll put a few likely suspects in the corner of each slide as we go along through the video. In general, they do have a good reputation online for both being well balanced and rolling well, and the typical prices are $32.50 or $27 for 25 dice dispensed in a tin like this. They're based in the USA but can ship worldwide, and if you were planning to pick up anything, if you enter the code Auspex, then you get an extra 5% off any order. so it could be a little bit cheaper than normal there. In any case, a big thank you for sponsoring the video, and you'll be able to spot a few fun designs in the top right corner that could be appropriate for certain factions as it goes on. Jumping back to the big armour though, and for the AdMech it's basically a 2-horse race between the Honoured Dunecrawler and the Scorpius Disintegrator, the only real things that fits the tank bill for this video. Kind of an interesting time for both of them as well, seeing as they both shoot a lot better with easy access to +1 ballistic skill and some massively boosted profiles compared with what they had before. For this one, I feel like they are kind of pretty close in terms of utility, though I chose to give it to the Honoured Dunecrawler, though I'd be interested to hear your guys' takes as to whether or not that's the right choice. The Onager's toughness 10, 11 wounds and a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable. Given the points difference and the invulnerable save, I'd rate it the tougher of the two, even if the Scorpius gets an extra wound, and for its primary weapon it's got a choice of several different ones. I feel like the neutron laser is maybe the one to beat though. Just big heavy hitting anti-tank damage is hard to go too far wrong with. 3 attacks at strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6 +2, and that one comes with a bonus Cognus Heavy Stubber as well, which certainly isn't nothing. If it's static and in Protector Doctrina, it does around about 10 wounds to a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle, and that's not too bad, even if that's not always going to be true, and the Heavy Stubbers could split fire a bit to threaten some lighter infantry. Otherwise, it's an alright target for stratagems, farming command points with its data tether, and perhaps the reason that I feel like it has the edge over the Scorpius is its aura of 4+ invulnerable save to nearby battle line troops, and I feel like that's really quite a big win in an army where battle line just became even more important than it already was. I feel like the addition of that special rule slightly tips the balance for me. Given the Scorpius only went up 5 points and got some massive boosts though, I think it's really interesting. 475 points, it's slightly faster and has an extra wound, and will often be hitting monsters and vehicles on 2+ on the move if it's in Protector Doctrina, and fairly nice general purpose firepower between those missiles and the Ferromite cannon. Quite nice to see both of them looking so much more dangerous than they were. Next up for the Adeptus Custodes, it's a contest between the Caladius Grav Tank and the Land Raider. Caladius tanks just do anti-tank really quite well though, and they've been a staple since the edition starts. 215 points for a big golden armoured vehicle, toughness 11 and 14 wounds with a 2+ save is pretty decent durability. Then I've seen more people taking the big anti-tank style shot, 4 shots at strength 12, AP 3, damage d6 +2 twin linked, and also lethal hits against vehicles and monsters as well. So there's a very good chance it converts wounds on quite a lot of those 4 shots. Overall it does its role really quite well, fairly tough and really quite threatening against enemy monsters and vehicles, and reasonably fast hovering around the battlefield. Land Raiders I don't think are terrible, but maybe tend to get neglected in favour of more golden bodies, given that the Custodes are generally fairly tanky when walking up the board. And the Telemann Dreadnought's definitely more of a dreadnought than a tank, and I still don't really think it competes with the Caladius in terms of fire support even after the points drop, unfortunately. Next up for the Grey Knights, again choices are kind of limited. Maybe the Land Raider and perhaps the Razorback are the closest that you get to gun tanks. Out of the two though, I'd certainly pick the Land Raider there. Can be a big armoured bulkhead to rumble up the board and allow Grey Knights to charge into the enemy at a good distance. And I feel like it's less bad an option than you might guess for Grey Knights, as it's just helpful to have at least some anchor units on the board, even if the majority of the army is jumping in and out of deep strike with their teleport rules. After the points change, the 3 variants seem a lot more balanced than they were. You can have the cheap Crusader at 220, the regular one at 240, or the Redeemer up at 285. I'd still probably be tempted to say that the Redeemer's worth it if you've got the extra 45 points, just with the absolutely massive overwatch it can do. It does seem like at that points differential, it's going to be a bit more balanced whether people choose to save a fair few points and just go for big anti-tank fire or big anti-horde fire instead though. For the Sisters of Battle, we've got the Castigator, 150 points in the new Codex, and a unit that didn't go up quite as much as a bunch of the other options did. This thing essentially being the Sisters of Battle Predator with some slightly different armaments. Its durability isn't really much to write home about against that sort of points cost, but given miracle dice, occasionally it could be worth it to put one into a saving throw against a massive damage characteristic. Just turning a big d6 +3 damage or something like that into an automatic save on that invulnerable could be kind of big. Generally people tend to be in favour of running the battle cannon, d6 +3 shots at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3 with blast and ignores cover. I feel like the ignores cover is really the clincher there. The AP -1 can just be pretty underwhelming against a bunch of targets otherwise. Now though, the Castigator in general has an AP debuff special rule rather than its token rerolls that it had before. and that's really quite nice that you can hand that out with any of its weapons, including the trio of heavy bolters it also comes with. Interestingly enough, it's kind of fun that castigators seem kind of awesome for buffing other castigators. Having the next one fire into the same target, or with an extra boost of AP on all of those scary weapons, does seem like a pretty cool thing to do. The autocannon's still fine, I think. It just falls down a little bit against things that have armor of contempt and good cover. It does put out some good volume fire with the heavy bolters too, and a few of the detachments can help it a bit. Bringers of Flame could have these moving about super quickly and maybe have extra strength on heavy bolters up close, even if it might be the detachment for Melters and Flamers more so than this. For competitors, the Exorcist still provides okay and direct fire, though it's pointed at a big premium, and the Immolator feels like a usable enough transport, splitting sister squads in half and getting a bit of melter goodness. It is maybe a shame that it lost its reroll rules though. For the Astra Militarum, I think previously it would have been the Demolisher Tank Commander to get this spot, though I feel like post-update, the Rogol Dawn does seem like it's very aggressively costed. 240 points gives you some immense stats and a whole ton of guns. 18 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save is pretty excellent for 240, and it was kind of fine for 260 as well, plus it's once per game cancel a save throw before rolling. Then its primary weapon is usually the Oppressor Cannon. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 is nice and general purpose, if not super high on the AP side. And then it backs that up with an autocannon, 2 multi-melters, a pulverizer, stubber, and either whole melters or stubbers on top of that. It'll usually be hitting on a 3+ with orders, and has easy access to other buffs with extra AP from Fields of Fire, or maybe an Exterminator tank, or re-rolling ones to hit with a Sentinel perhaps. And in the recent updates, Born Soldiers just granted lethal hits to all of its weapons against anything that's a monster or vehicle, even when it's on the move. And that also feels super big for this tank in particular, given how many of its weapons are strength 9. At the new cost, it just seems kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Otherwise, Demolisher tank commanders still are pretty scary, even if they did lose out with the Born Soldier buff. That might send a few more people back to the more generic Ross variants. The shoots on death thing that they have is still really big though, and their damage output is good. The Lehman Russ Exterminator maybe felt like it won big from the Born Soldiers change. That plasma cannon will now lethal hits against tough stuff, so it means now it's one of the most efficient against elite infantry and also absolutely fine against tougher targets. And otherwise, Sentinels feel particularly good for the guard, certainly not tanks, but as armoured walking gun things, I thought I'd throw them a shout. The armoured ones in particular do feel like they're collectively about the same sort of threat and loads of toughness as something like a Russ variant. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Imperial Knights, where of course they're walkers, so they very much don't have tanks. Though for gun turret knight units, I'd go with the Armiger Helverin as the next closest thing. The big knights feel like they're more sort of big stompy characters on a whole different level. I guess if we were talking best tank for the army, it'd literally only be them and Armiger Moiraxes, if we're going with the no melee and no full-scale knight sort of criteria. And out of those two, both of them I think are usable, though Helverins tend to get played more. Helverins definitely see play in competitive lists, very usable for a bit of backfield fire support with mass damage 3 autocannon shots. The anti-fly 2+ that they can get if they're within their deployment zone or on objectives and things can be pretty big against certain fly targets like Catan. And if you want to focus fire with a couple of them, then they can gain some extra AP with Squire's Duty, which can be the difference between them being very lackluster and genuinely quite a big chip damage threat. They could be helped out with some bondsman abilities like the Knight Crusader, and they certainly like the inbuilt rerolls, particularly now it's one hit and wound reroll full stop. The Armiger Moiraxes are a fair bit more, though they do have several pretty cool weapon profiles. The Conversion Beamers get on very well with the inbuilt nightly rerolls, though the Grav and Lightning Locks still are okay against the right targets. In general though, out of the two, I see far more people playing Helverins versus Moiraxes. Next up, and going into the ranks of Chaos, I feel like the quadrupedal Dinobot Forge Fiend is closer to a walking tank than a traditional walker, and I have chosen to give this one the shout out here, though realistically I feel like the Chaos Vindicator and Predator both will be kind of similar kind of level, even if both of those went up a bit, the Predator to 140 and the Vindicator to 185. Forge Fiends have generally been pretty strong since the edition came out, triple ectoplasma cannons typically being the loadout, giving you 3d3 strength 10, AP3 and damage 3 shots, all with the blast keyword, which means that you get a ridiculous amount more shots against things like hordes. And if it makes sense and you're firing against some invulnerable saves or something, you can overcharge them for some devastating wounds. Like the other gun tanks, they can have a lot of use from several other detachments. I feel like they're still really interesting in pack bound, given the Nurgle sustained hits that they can get, plus the can't shoot me style stratagem, or undivided for some rerolls, particularly the reroll or wound rerolls, devastating shooting. That can make their strength 10 profile get a lot more wounds against truly tough stuff, and a fair few more of those are likely to be 6s. Otherwise, the Soulforged Hunting Pack is really scary for them. You can get a big reroll enhancement on one of the Warp Smiths, and also a +1 to wound at range on top of that if they risk some extra risky dark packs. Against anything toughness 10 or greater though, then that's well worth it. Otherwise, Renegade Raiders still does pretty nicely for shooting units. You can advance and shoot there, get AP -4 against objectives, and do have some useful stratagems too. Just for chaos shooting in general, they've got other options as well. Hellbrutes and Abaddon, particularly put together, can make dark packs go off with a massive bang. And Vashtor, if he's about, could make them strength 11 on the shooting, which could be relevant against a couple of targets out there, though kind of specific. The main downsides for the Forge Fiend feel like it's got a big price tag for the amount of defense it has. It definitely feels like it's more about the damage than the durability. Otherwise, though, I'd absolutely rate the Chaos Vindicator and the Predator Destructor as fairly solid gun tanks, even with their slightly increased points. Getting dark packs and some of those detachment synergies can still make them very scary indeed. Next up, the World Eaters do chain axes more so than tanks. I feel like compared with some of their rival legions, they don't have as much interest for things like their Predators or Forge Fiends. The Forge Fiend's kind of expensive and doesn't have a particularly great rule, and the Predator tanks are alright, but just seem a lot inferior to, say, standard Chaos Marines where they get their dark packs to amp up their damage. Putting all those to the side, I guess I'll rate the Land Raider as top tank here. It is pretty tough and does contribute some long-range anti-tank firepower, which you don't normally get all that much in World Eaters lists. At least it does contribute to delivering some melee things into battle, most likely some Khorne Berserkers with attached characters. I feel like the issue with the Land Raider though is just it doesn't really feel super necessary for any one unit. 8-bound are pretty fast and can either scout or be given scout by Lord Invocators. Berserkers often tend to be happier in cheap rhinos, maybe not having the sheer alpha level melee threat that really warrants an entire Land Raider being dedicated to them, and Terminators generally aren't seen as the most optimal choice and can deep strike and rapid ingress to get them there. Feels like if World Eaters had a slower moving but extra devastating melee units that needed the delivery more, the Land Raider might get a bit more of a look in. I still think it's alright for Berserkers though. I feel like if you actually want shooting gun turrets, the in-codex options are going to have stiff competition from things like the War Dog Brigand, really quite fast moving and genuinely quite threatening. Maybe the Lord of Skulls is worth a mention as well, though it definitely doesn't feel like just a tank given the ridiculous scale chain axe that it has. I'll admit I'm maybe not being super consistent on that front, by for the Thousand Suns wanting to talk about the Mutalith Vortex Beast, particularly interesting at the moment for the faction given that it got a points drop down to 150. This one's perhaps the least tanky tank on the list here. Certainly more of a monster, though it feels like it's more of a primarily ranged and support type beast as opposed to a dedicated melee threat, though it still can punch in combat a bit with a bunch of strength 9 damage 4 attacks, so in reality maybe it is a bit more mixed threat. If you want to discount the Mutalith Vortex Beast, then my choice is the Forge Fiend. In terms of actual use to the army though, the Mutalith just seems better. It's really quite sturdy as it's stomping its way up the board. Toughness 10, 13 wounds, a 5+ invulnerable, and then a 5+ feel no pain, meaning that on average you need to destroy around about 20 wounds worth of Mutalith before it goes down. That's quite a big deal. It certainly has enough ranged threats to put it on par with certain battle tanks out there. That Warp Vortex can threaten a shot with a single shot at strength 18, AP -4, and damage d6 + 6 with devastating wounds. Pretty crazy that it can just potentially one-shot a battle tank with one good roll. They can swap it out for both an anti-space marine and a flamethrower type profile if that makes more sense, so it's pretty flexible if it needs to be and could even overwatch a bit if needed. Otherwise it's got an aura of mortal wounds to throw out some chip damage as it scraps in the midfield, plus it doubles the range of Kabbalistic rituals like Doombolt. Can be handy to throw that at things that are really quite a long way away. Finally, it does have a bit of melee that's useful enough against some elite or lighter infantry. I feel like it's probably more of a ranged and support piece, primarily more so than melee, even if it can do a bit of that. I was kind of surprised that these went down in cost for the Thousand Suns. I know they made a few of the rituals a bit weaker, but they were already a very strong army and they weren't hit that hard, and the Mutalith was already quite a competitive model for them. Otherwise though, if we did discount it, the Thousand Sons Forge Fiend is actually perhaps a surprisingly good choice. Most Thousand Sons lists don't tend to take it as they want to play more into the core strategy, taking lots of Rubik Marines and Sorcerers and things, but this one's only 135 at a pretty massive discount versus the other one for the loss of Dark Pacts, and you still get the same defensive profile for that, and it does come with an alright handy debuff of -1 to hit at the unit that you shoot. If you just want a absolutely dedicated gun tank, then the Forge Fiend might be the one to look at. Next up for the Death Guard, I feel like they're perhaps fairly well balanced right now. Before the update, I would have said the Plague Burst Crawler, 180 points for at least a fairly sturdy vehicle with a 2+ save and 12 wounds, a couple of entropy cannons for some long-range anti-tank, and then a mortar for d6+3, strength 8, AP1 and damage 2 shots that could get buffed by a few different things. Lords of Virulence for ignoring cover and a +1 to hit, Mortarion for ignoring modifiers if he's about, and potentially the extra AP from their core detachment rule. They did unfortunately take a great big nerf, hitting on a 4+ now, and that was quite a big blow to Death Guard armies, as quite a few armies were running these. I still don't think that blow has taken them completely out of use, but it's definitely going to make them a lot more of a maybe choice as opposed to something that so many competitive lists run. Otherwise though, it does have a couple of good competitors. The Death Guard Predator Destructor is pretty nice for 130 points. A big autocannon with a bunch of damage 3 shots that get extra AP against infantry, and again Death Guard can up the AP against targets in contagion range against armies that they need to. At least compared with a few of the competitors, I've seen a few people running the Plague Heavy Bolters over las cannons, given that they can get up to high AP and they also get the lethal hits. Las cannons would still probably be my default though. After the update, maybe stretching the definition of a tank, the Mephitic Blight Hauler at 90 points, I think has gained a lot on the other two as well. I probably would have put it behind the Predator Destructor before, but now it's dropped to 90 points, it feels a lot more usable. A multi-melter and a missile launcher that are okay anti-elite fire, and then get +1 to wound against vehicles. Still maybe not crazy stuff on the damage front, but at 90 points they're fairly cheap and disruptive. Next up for the Chaos Knights, the Wardog Brigand at 170 points is probably the closest thing if we're going for non-Titanic Knights. Its only competition would be the Executioner and the Moirax once more, and kind of safe to say that this one is seen as the best given that just about every Chaos Knight list tends to be spamming big numbers of these things. As they have been all edition, they're still very nasty little shooting knights. The weapons hit on a 2+ with the big Demon Breath Spear and the Chain Cannon, both giving you scary anti-tank shooting, backed up by a good bit of anti-horde clearance, and you get extra AP against the closest thing to keep that chain cannon good against things that have got okay saves. They often tend to take Havoc launchers on top, which I guess will be slightly nerfed now, given that they'll be hitting on a 4+, not a 3, but still having just a little bit of scattergun indirect fire really isn't the worst if you just desperately need to destroy one thing that your army can't see. Otherwise, certain knights can help them out a bit, like the Desecrator to allow some rerolls, and they've got a good supporting stratagem at getting sustained hits 1 if you have multiple brigands shooting at the same target, or sustained hits 2 if they happen to be battle shocked, which is extra nasty. I wouldn't say they're super durable for the cost, but they are threatening very fast and have got good objective control. Plus, knights are generally going to stretch enemy anti-tank firepower, given that the vast majority of their models are likely to be vehicles. For the Chaos Demons, they're certainly not an army that really do tanks in the traditional sense. I guess if we're going by armoured thing that is a primarily ranged threat, it might be between the Skull Cannon and the Burning Chariot, I guess. The Soul Grinder, I guess, is a big armoured thing. It definitely feels mixed role and hits pretty hard in close combat, just about as hard as it does at range. Maybe between the Skull Cannon and the Burning Chariot I might be tempted by the Skull Cannon, given that it dropped a bunch of points in the last balance update, now down to 95. That does make it feel like maybe a bit more of a cheap and disposable sort of unit that you can have to help screen out the backfield while keeping up a bit of volume fire. Its durability isn't awful, with a 4+ invulnerable save and 9 wounds, and at range it spits out d6+2, strength 9, AP1 and damage 2 attacks with blast, handing out a battle shock test which can be alright given Shadow of Chaos. If the enemy does get too close to it, it can do a bit of melee threat with a bunch of Hellblade attacks from those bloodletters. I'm still not sure I'd really say that its damage output is particularly standout either at range or in melee. Maybe not awful for a tiny bit of fire support though on a cheap unit that can screen things out a bit. Otherwise I might say that the Soul Grinder perhaps looks like the better overall unit given it does actually have some serious threat and is pretty tanky at 180 points, Maybe the problem for that is it's competing against the greater demons, which were already really strong and just got better in the balanced data slate. Casting around auras of Shadow of Chaos is nice, and the Burning Chariot maybe does have a bit more threat than the Skull Cannon, but you're also paying quite a lot more points for it at 115. Still seems usable but not standout though. In reality, I feel like demons for the most part are going to be more looking towards their greater demons, more so than their armoured things and chariots. Lastly, let's move on to the Xenos, and we'll start off with the Aeldari Falcon. It maybe felt like there were a few tanks that I could have happily talked about here. They seem kind of balanced, though I've definitely seen a few people using the Falcon often to deliver fire dragons, maybe potentially dire Avengers. It moves quickly at 14 inches, and it isn't really all that tough for the cost. Has a pulse laser for a bunch of strength 9 damage d6 attacks, plus likely a bright lance to make some good use of the battle host rerolls, and maybe a shuriken cannon. And it does also have the option of deep striking if you want, where it could deep strike and then fire dragons could get out of it to light up the enemy vehicles with some reroll wound rolls. Overall, I think it's interesting enough, has a fair bit of threat in itself, isn't super fragile, at least for Aeldari, and pretty much guarantees the alpha strike with some fragile infantry that could easily make a mess of a big enemy target or vehicle or something. Otherwise though, fire dragons are still alright at 180 points. Far from the menace that they were at the start of the edition, they still have some big anti-tank threats and can do some clever tricks linking fire and maybe fire and fading. War Walkers might be one of the best all-around anti-tank fire support type units, though I feel like they don't really count as tanks in the same way as the Grav tanks do. And Wave Serpents as a transport with a big gun and an armoured hull, feel like they might be worth a mention as well. They can certainly be nice for certain units that you might want to deliver into combat, perhaps Ivrain and a bunch of Harlequin troops. For the Drukhari, it feels like they only really have the one major choice in the Ravager. Not exactly a tank, but the closest that they get in a sort of heavy support skimmer mounting a bunch of big guns. I guess maybe the Tantalus could be a competitor from the Forge World side of things. That's also usable enough, though I feel like I see more people using Ravagers than those. The Ravager's a good unit though, I think. Kind of simple and effective and hard to go too far wrong with, though not every list chooses to take them. 110 points buys you 3 Dart Lances. They move fast at 14 inches, though aren't super durable with toughness 9 and 11 wounds. The main thing that it adds is its damage output with 3 shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2, dedicated anti-tank for the Cabals. They get to reroll hit rolls of 1 against units at starting strength and could potentially feed in a pain token for full hit rerolls against something else. And maybe could be an interesting choice in Inari as well, allied to the Aeldari, and get some of those scary battle host rerolls on the go. Previously in competitive lists, Scourges tended to get taken for the anti-tank role before Ravagers did. Just fairly intimidating to have some fast-moving infantry that can just jump out of objectives, shoot with dart lances, and then jump back behind cover. They've gone up 10 points though, and the Ravager's gone down a bit, so I feel that that's redressed the balance a bit there. I wouldn't be too surprised if a few more people are considering the Ravager for the anti-tank purposes as a result. For the Tyranids, I feel like it's hard to rate anything else besides arguably their best gun beast that just got a buff. The Exocrine was easily one of the most reliably taken datasheets in the vast majority of Tyranid army lists, generally being one of the few things that can stack some good damage against high save things. And while maybe it feels a little bit more like the Tyranid equivalent of just a big gun on legs, it definitely has the toughness and armor of a battle tank. For its 135 points, its durability is pretty nice, toughness 10, 14 wounds and a 3+ save, and its primary weapon is really quite good for anti-elite firepower. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 is good against Terminators or other 2 or 3 wound infantry. It's got heavy to hit on a 2+ if it's static, and blasts to increase your shots against bigger units, and it still managed to get away with getting a direct damage boost from Games Workshop, going from strength 8 to strength 9 in the last update. Not super impactful, but will help against things like toughness 8 and toughness 9 targets like some light transports. It then also doubles down on marking its hit target for reroll ones to hit against anything else that might fire, so it can work quite well in a battery of 3 of them. They'll still like invasion fleets, where you might be able to get lethal hits against tanks and vehicles if you're going against an army mainly made of them, but I feel like it's going to be one of the ones that most likes the Hive Tyrant's aura of assault and lethal hits. It just makes it really quite general purpose firepower with that big high AP gun. Already pretty excellent against elite infantry, and then just getting so much better against tough targets where you get the auto wounds on 6s, plus even making it a bit faster into the bargain as well. Otherwise though, for strong Tyranid contenders, it feels like the Tyrannifex got a new lease of life, with a Rupture Cannon going up to d6 plus 6 damage. It's still a bit of a casino cannon, having the option to utterly ruin certain units or utterly fail, but it does have good defense, and the Acid Spray is alright as well for a bit of midfield overwatch. And Meliceptors are still quite nice frontline beasts. A bunch of strength 10 damage 3 shooting that can be quite good against medium tanks and terminators and things, a little bit of melee and kind of survivable between the 4+ invulnerable save and the close range debuffs it has. For their cultist allies, the Genestealer Cults don't really have much besides the Goliath Rock Grinder outside of Brood Brother allies. I feel like maybe the tongue-in-cheek answer might be the Rogue or Dawn Battle Tank, I guess. Otherwise though, it feels like the Rock Grinder is really the only fitting choice here. Even that's kind of an upgraded mining truck, but one that's got really quite a lot of threat. Otherwise, for gun-focused vehicles, you've got the Transport and the Goliath truck, which is kind of fine but not standout. And the Achilles Ridge Runner definitely doesn't feel like a tank, given it's a light vehicle buggy type thing, but if you did count that, it would easily be the best, seeing as it seems to be the single best Genestealer Cult datasheet right now. For the Rock Grinder, I'd say it's okay, though not really standout. It's certainly better than it was earlier in the edition when it was 155 points, at least it's down to 125 now. It's still not super tough for the cost at toughness 10 and 10 wounds, though its threat isn't awful. You can have a big mining laser with D3 shots and blast, plus a bit of melee threat with a bunch of strength 10 AP2 and damage 2 attacks. Perhaps throw some demo charges around and transport a light unit into battle. Could maybe be one option for delivering some acolytes or something, though the low transport capacity means that you're not really getting too many points worth of things here outside of Aberrants, which Games Workshop seem to have unfortunately overcosted a bit recently. In general, for its abilities, it still feels a little bit weak for what it really would want to be, kind of a shame from the Codex really. I guess it is at least a fairly focal unit in the Outlander Force, where it could get some things like -1 damage and things, though even there I feel like just buffing 125 points of unit isn't super standout for the stratagems that it gets. Maybe a little bit negative there. I think it's not truly unusable in a casual setting. I feel like it's unlikely to be seen too much in competitive though. Next up, we've got the Leagues of Votann Sagittor at 115 points. Again, the leagues are waiting a lot more model releases, hopefully in 10th edition, so the contest here is between this and the Land Fortress. To my mind, I feel like the Sagittor has enough armor and a big gun on it to currently be functioning more like a battle tank than a transport, though obviously it does both. It is at the point where people are spamming them and taking the Sagittors for the sake of the Sagittors more so than anything that's inside them, and they're pretty sturdy with their toughness 10 and 9 wounds, and fairly hard hitting with either the choice of a beam cannon or missile launcher. For their profiles, the beam cannon gets you 2 shots at strength 12 AP3 and damage D6 with sustained hits D3. The missiles get you 2 heavy shots at a similar sort of profile and a further L7 missile shot as well. Overall, it basically works out that the beam cannon's better against big tough targets that are toughness 10 or higher, and the missiles are generally a little bit better against elite infantry out of the two. Otherwise, it has a bolt cannon, has a nice scout move to get it into the midfield, so you're able to get lines of sight on those doubly marked judgment things nice and early and earn your command point rewards. And their transport capacity is useful as well. You can split units of Hearthkin warriors in half to allow you to get some cheap small units of 50-point models. That's quite nice with actions at the moment and their sticky objectives, or they could deliver some Chthonian Berserks into combat where these seem like one of the best options. They might have got just a little bit more relevant, if anything, now they've got Hernkin Jaegers to allow them to take the midfield and know that you've definitely got some room to scout into if you want to. Lots of good things all in all. Overall, I'd probably rate them as the very slightly stronger unit, but I think the Hecaton Land Fortress is absolutely very usable, and maybe in real terms is the thing that is actually the true tank of the Leagues of Votann. Lots of big scary firepower and great defense that can have an Armor of Contempt type stratagem. For the Necrons, for best hovering gun tank, I think the Doomsday Ark is a fairly clear winner there, probably the biggest single competitor being the Monolith, and the Canoptech Doomstalker if you count it, though only in Canoptech Court. Doomsday Arks just do the role of a main battle tank really quite well for the Necrons quite well though I think. 200 points and hovering in the backfield with toughness 9, a 4+ invulnerable save and 14 wounds. The toughness 9 maybe seems kind of underwhelming, and it does mean a few things are a bit more threat to it, but that 4 plus invulnerable save is pretty amazing, and does mean that a lot of high AP on enemy tank weapons that are likely to be shooting that far is kind of wasted. You can't really afford to just damage it and leave it be as well, as still just regrow with living metal in a few turns. The Doomsday Cannon has got plenty of nice firepower, D6 plus 1, strength 18, AP 4, and damage 4 shots, heavy and devastating wounds if it can remain stationary, though it's still threatening enough to move if it needs line of sight. Outside of Canoptek Court, it's perhaps the most commonly taken heavy firepower, maybe kind of competing a little bit with Locust heavy destroyers. I'd probably rate it the slightly better of the two though, due to the good durability, and a bit of split roll with a bunch of Gauss flayers to mess up enemy infantry if they get too close to your deployment zone. It can potentially use Hypercrypt quite well as well. If it's not going to be able to get line of sight on the thing it most wants to, it could teleport around the board and draw a bead with a scary cannon warping out of nowhere. Otherwise, for competitors, as mentioned, the Monolith I still think is absolutely fine, even if it did go up in cost a bit. It still has some scary death rays, is a lot of effort to bring down with all of that 2 plus armor save living metal, and has some pretty cool movement options in Hypercrypt. The Doomstalker went up to 145 points recently, which takes the shine off them a bit. Even in Canoptek Court now, I feel like they're not really significantly ahead of the Doomsday arc, though the big rerolls that they get and some powerful stratagems still make them probably the better choice. Even with the rerolls, their raw damage output isn't directly superior against everything though. I'd certainly go for Doomsday arcs outside of that detachment. For the Tau, their tanks also had a recent points adjustment. Prior to the update, I would have given it as a clean win for the Hammerhead. They were the ones being taken by far more than Skyrays in competitive lists, so for Tau realistically they're competing against their battlesuits, with broadsides perhaps being the best direct anti-tank damage dealers after the big points drop down to 180 points for 2 broadsides, and now likely rate them and their heavy rail rifles as best for that role. Riptides are still solid as durable midfield tanky threats that enjoy mod car and can fall back and shoot, and ghost kills are still very nice for annoying interference with their lone operative things. As for the actual tanks though, I would have gone for the Hammerhead over the Skyray. Due to the points differential before, now the Skyray's 140 and the Hammerhead's 145, they seem genuinely really quite evenly balanced. For anti-tank threat it feels like a bit of a wash, the Hammerhead and its railgun being a bit swingier, better against some targets and worse against others, and still has the chance of some bad luck if the dice gods punish you despite your rerolls. The Skyray may be a little bit more reliable and a little bit cheaper, though the Hammerhead also gets Seeker missiles as well, giving it a better alpha strike. The Skyray gets the advantage of reroll hit rolls against fly things though, and matchup dependent that probably puts that ahead. Overall, between the two at those points cost, it feels kind of well balanced, either one of them being pretty reasonable to take for the same role, though broadsides would probably be the first place that I look at the moment. Finally, for the Orks, they don't really have all that many things that really fit the tank criteria. I really feel like Games Workshop should just get around to making them release a proper looted tank or looted wagon type thing. I feel like they're missing a trick there, with that being a big gap in the Orky roster, and something they've basically always had in the lore. In absence of that, though, the battle wagon feels like the single thing that easily fits the tank role the best, and at the moment it is also pretty strong in game too, mainly as just a big and very very durable hunk of welded together metal. Toughness 10 going up to toughness 12 if you sacrifice the firing deck, a big 16 wounds and a 6 plus invulnerable save, all for 160 points. And then perhaps best of all, a -1 AP debuff, which can combine with cover for a lot of very hard wounds to take down, even with fairly dedicated anti-tank guns. They're perhaps best used if you've got a big scary mob of 20 boys with a couple of support characters, or perhaps Gazkel himself wanting a ride into battle alongside some mega knobs. Kind of nice that they can finally transport him now. And then after that can just be a big durable annoying unit, blazing away with a whole bunch of guns that won't hit very accurately but might occasionally do something cool, and then trying to run over people with its death roller and a few attacks with a grabbing claw and wrecking ball. Otherwise, for the Orks, if you want to transport some beast snaggers around, the Killed rig I still think is good for its cost. That's particularly nice given that it can overwatch with some auto-hitting las cannon fire, which is very unusual in 40k. The walkers and things don't really feel completely direct shooting platforms or anything like that, though plenty of them are kind of alright in Dread Mob, though don't tend to be very standout elsewhere. A quick rest in peace to the Grot tanks and the Kill tank, which went away from Forge World. In any case, with those Xenos factions talked about, that just about brings us to the end of this one. Loads of big scary tanks out there in Warhammer 40k at the moment. lots of which are pretty integral to their factions. I'm genuinely a little bit hesitant to mark anyone as best overall. I'm not really sure that any one of them really goes to the point where they're truly overpowered in their own right, but often tend to be really quite strong and usable things within their army. Some armies often tending to rely on them quite a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean that those factions are crazily strong within Warhammer 40k. Perhaps for a few particularly standout ones, I feel like the Castigator is a pretty awesome fire support piece for the Sisters of Battle. Rogue Dawns, particularly in multiples, look like they could be incredibly intimidating to fight against, given their massive durability and big general purpose firepower. The Mutalith Vortex Beast is a pretty major support piece and a big boost to the Thousand Suns. I'm sure plenty of armies will be tempted to bring one of those along. Wardog Brigands are truly ubiquitous to the Chaos Knights, though partly due to lack of other options that seem to be as good as them. And for Xenos factions, maybe the Exocrines, Sagitors, and the Necron Doomsday Arcs feel like they're some of the standout picks for their respective factions. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the tanks. Which ones of these do you tend to use or fear and why? And which one would you rate as the best? A big thank you, as mentioned, to Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out his link down in the video description. Lots of very fancy dice on offer that could look nice next to some of these armies. I'll certainly be looking forward to sharing those Auspex dice when there's more news there. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k videos most days. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page as well, and that's down in the video description. Channel Patreon supporters do get a few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.